From coast to coast in Newfoundland and Labrador, this is Issues and Answers with Michael Connors.
Good afternoon and welcome to NTV's Issues and Answers. Education Minister Paul Dinn says the tuition freeze is coming back to Memorial University this year. But MUN President Janet Morrison says if that happens, there would need to be an increase in the operating grant.
Has said it many times that we're not going to let university balance the books on the backs of the students. And part of that is no tuition increases until we see or are confident that the Memorial University are addressing their fiscal challenges. So right now, until we see that, there's a tuition freeze for them.
And to be very blunt, we have two sources of revenue. We have grant funding and we have tuition. If one of those things is held constant, then we need the other to compensate.
Joining me this week to discuss this is the chair of the Canadian Federation of Students in Newfoundland and Labrador, Nicolas Keough. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess first of all, it was kind of interesting how this came out. It was your press release that I guess alerted everyone that the government had committed to the tuition freeze this year. So how did this come about?
Yeah, so there was a promise made before the election that Memorial would not be allowed to increase its tuition until it got its financial house in order. But we really didn't know what that meant until we had a meeting earlier this week on Monday with all 5 student unions present and myself. And so we met with the minister and a few other members of the Department of Education, and he committed to a tuition freeze for the 2026 year.
Right. And was there any other detail beyond that, like when it would take effect? Like, is this next fall this happens? Was there any other information?
Yeah, so the assumption is that next fall, because next fall is when the tuition would have increased under the current plan. And so that increase will not be happening this year.
Now, were there any other commitments made? And because the president of the university, Dr. Janet Morrison, raised this, I guess the university has 2 main sources of revenue: tuition fees and its government operating grant. And there had been a tuition freeze for over 2 decades. And the way that worked is that the government provided a special grant of about $70 million a year to offset what would have been required had the university increased tuition. Has there been any commitment on restoring that grant?
Yeah, so we spoke about that in the meeting. It's something that we brought up on Monday that we needed to see, in order for this not to end up falling on the backs of students again, we need to see an increase in the funding to Memorial. And that's not just to tie over the tuition freeze. We need an increase because over the last 10 years, we've seen a dramatic decrease in funding overall to Memorial, and that has caused a lot of these problems that we're seeing now with less student supports offered and less just available course programs. There's a lot of issues that students are facing because of the reduction in funding from the provincial government, and it's something that we did bring up to the province. In terms of Memorial, we absolutely agree, but we still think that it's definitely something to celebrate, that students will be getting a break this year and not having to pay as much for tuition.
Right. So you want to see the increase in the grant, the university wants to see the increase in the grant. Was there any commitment from the minister that will happen in this year's budget?
No.
Okay. So I guess that's still raising questions, because I know, like, your fellow student organization, MUN, still had a lot of, like, how is this going to happen? How is this going to be brought into effect? So do you have any concerns that there's still a lot of unanswered questions here?
Absolutely. There's always going to be concerns, but I think that the important thing is that this is a big win for students. It's something we've been focused on for the last 5 years. Ever since the 2021 budget announced that the tuition freeze would be lifted, we have been fighting against the government policy of ending the tuition freeze and hiking tuition, and it seems as though we've finally gotten somewhere with a tuition freeze this year.
Well, what would it mean for the lives of students to see this freeze happen? Because we have seen a substantial increase in the last few years.
Yeah, it would mean a lot. I think there are a lot of students that have dropped out of university because they haven't been able to afford the new tuition rates. They haven't been able to afford the increases. A lot of people who were planning to go to university that now can't because of the increased rates. And a lot of students, even if they can go, they're working extra jobs. They're not focusing as much on their studies. Their mental health suffers. They're worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about their housing. And I think that this will at least alleviate some of the burden. However, it's not much. We still need to see a broader commitment for reductions in tuition. We need to see a multi-year plan for a longer-term freeze. And we need to see one that includes students at the college in the North Atlantic.
Right. And I guess, what are your thoughts about the state of, I guess, the university overall? I mean, it's been well documented that the campus is crumbling. How is that affecting students?
Yeah, I think it's really affecting students. As I said, student supports are less available now. We're seeing cuts to programs, we're seeing cuts to course offerings. Students are absolutely feeling the brunt of this. Obviously, we're also seeing issues with the infrastructure at some of MUN's campuses. That has been a big issue that we've raised in the past. Student unions and faculty unions brought that up with the Fund MUN campaign last year, calling on the government to increase funding to the university, which they did slightly, but it's not enough, and we really hope to see the provincial government increase funding even more.
The new PC government had kind of tied this to the university getting its finances in order, and we did kind of, now they said there was no connection, but we did see some moves from the university this week in terms of cutting 4 out of 7 VP positions. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there are a lot of things that are left unanswered with that. Honestly, we represent students at the Marine Institute, we represent students at Grenfell and at the Labrador campus, and so we want to make sure that there still are decision-making processes that include those campuses, although we are unequivocally very happy about the commitment to address administrative load. It's been an issue for a really long time, but we would like to see how it's implemented and how it impacts decision-making at the university.
Right, because for example, Grenfell will no longer have its own vice president now, is my understanding. That was something that had been brought in 15 years ago to give them more autonomy. So what concerns do you have there?
Yeah, we're just worried with Grenfell and the Marine Institute, as they used to each have a VP. I think we're worried about the fact that they might become overlooked and that they might not be treated with the same importance as they were with the 7 vice president structure. However, again, it's still an improvement. We just want to make sure that there still are considerations being made for these other campuses.
Right. And I guess it's always a bit of a tricky issue when the government sort of talks about freezing tuition, because the university is supposed to be autonomous. Ultimately, this has to go to the Board of Regents. I guess what are your thoughts on, I guess, maintaining the independence of the university from government itself?
I mean, I think that throughout the 22-year tuition freeze, the government decided that. The government decided it in 1999. They gave funding for tuition freeze, and they repeatedly made election promises. All parties made election promises throughout those 22 years. They were the ones who created the tuition freeze, and they made it happen. So absolutely, it's an autonomous university, but the funding does come from the province, and the province is definitely accountable to make sure that students can access education in this province. Because if we don't have a public university in this province, then we're in real trouble in terms of our future as a province.
In terms of a blanket freeze on tuition, I mean, what's your response to the argument? Some would argue that these, rather than creating a blanket freeze for all students, even for those who can't afford to pay, targeting assistance for students who need it most instead.
I think that creates more loopholes, more hurdles to jump through for students. I think it's been shown not to work in the past. Obviously, we're pro grants. We're not pro student loans, but we are pro increasing the number of grants. But we would like to see just a general decrease in tuition, because that is the easiest way to make sure that education is accessible for everyone. And it doesn't matter what your background is. It's supposed to be accessible for everyone. We wouldn't have K to 12 be mandated based on your income either. It's important that education is offered to anybody who wants to study.
Right. That's an interesting point about decreasing, because I guess they're bringing back a freeze now after a few years of substantial increases. If you go back to the history, originally there was a freeze back in 98, 99. Then Roger Grimes actually decreased tuition by 25% and then froze it again. I mean, was there any discussion about a reduction in fees at all?
Yeah, it's something that we're definitely fighting for. We're advocating for to the provincial government, and it's something that we'll be advocating for in the lead up to the provincial budget as well. But we do still understand that this is a major win. Having the freeze in itself is a major win. But yeah, we need to see a tuition decrease. It's been exorbitant costs for students. We've seen the campus food bank at the MUN St. John's campus close because of these tuition increases. We've seen a 20% drop in undergraduate enrollment. It really is important that we rectify this problem, not just stop the increases.
Just very quickly, were there any other major student issues that you discussed with government?
Yeah, we talked about work terms for CNA students and MUN students, and making sure that students are paid for their work terms, as well as the promise that the PC's made about a tuition refund. And we're trying to get a little bit more clarity on that, just more details as they come out in terms of what that refund process will look like, who's eligible, because we would like to see, obviously, as many students as possible be able to avail of that.
Well, Nicolas, Keough, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.